The morning fog was still clinging to the streets of London as Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his eyes fixed on the foggy window. The sharp scent of tobacco filled the air, curling lazily from the pipe in his hand. Dr. John Watson, ever his faithful companion, sat across from him, leafing through a medical journal, though his attention was drawn intermittently to the detective, whose mind was clearly elsewhere. Holmes, always at the height of concentration, had been unusually quiet for the past hour. Watson was accustomed to these silent moments but could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. It wasn't until the clock on the mantelpiece chimed, marking the hour, that Holmes broke the silence. "You have been wondering when I will finally speak, Watson, haven't you?" he said, his voice as sharp as ever, though laced with a peculiar note of contemplation. Watson looked up from his journal, surprised but masking his concern with a steady gaze. "I didn't want to disturb you, Holmes. But yes, it's not like you to be so still, so quiet for so long." Holmes smiled faintly, though his eyes remained distant. "It is not stillness, Watson. It is waiting. My mind is occupied with something. A puzzle has presented itself, and I must consider it carefully before I reveal its contours." Watson raised an eyebrow. "A puzzle? A new case, then?" Holmes set the pipe down, his sharp gaze turning toward Watson as if the moment had finally arrived to break the silence. "Indeed, a rather intriguing one, I must say. The letter was brought to me this morning by way of our usual courier." He reached for an envelope on the nearby table and handed it to Watson, who unfolded the letter with a growing sense of curiosity. The handwriting was neat but firm, the ink still fresh as though the sender had written it only moments before. The letter began with a sense of urgency, its message stark and direct. "Mr. Holmes, I am writing to you in great distress, as I find myself in a situation that I cannot understand, let alone resolve. My brother Samuel Bennett has gone missing in New York City. I have not heard from him in 3 days, and his disappearance appears to be both sudden and unexplainable. I am deeply troubled by this, and I believe he may have encountered something dangerous, something hidden from the public eye. The authorities are of little help, as you might imagine. I am asking for your expertise in this matter. Please, Mr. Holmes, my brother's life may be at risk. Yours sincerely, Clara Bennett." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed in thought as Watson read the letter. "Samuel Bennett, New York City. Missing for 3 days, you say?" Watson asked, raising his gaze. "That's a peculiar request, especially coming from across the ocean. Why, if the case is so urgent, has this woman turned to you instead of the New York police?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "That is what interests me, Watson. It is not the letter itself, but the tone, the content. Miss Clara Bennett believes something more sinister is at work here, something that has escaped the attention of the local authorities. And that is where my curiosity is piqued." "Something hidden?" Watson mused, setting the letter aside. "A conspiracy, perhaps?" Holmes nodded slowly, the sharp lines of his face sharpening further as he contemplated the possibilities. "Or a hidden hand, a force lurking in the shadows, operating beyond the reach of ordinary men. But why would someone go to such lengths to disappear a man? What is it that Samuel Bennett knew? Or perhaps what was he involved in?" Watson frowned. "You think there's more to this than a simple missing person case?" "I do," Holmes replied. The urgency in the letter, the clear fear in the writer's words. They are not the signs of a family member merely worried about an ordinary disappearance. There is something far more dangerous at play here. I am certain of it. He rose from his chair and began pacing back and forth across the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "The only logical conclusion is that something, or someone, has forcibly removed Samuel Bennett from the scene. But removed for what reason? And more importantly, by whom?" Watson could see that Holmes was already forming a web of possibilities in his mind, his brain tirelessly piecing together the puzzle. "New York City is a vast place, Holmes," Watson remarked. "Even with your remarkable abilities, how can you be certain this is more than just an unfortunate event?" Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face Watson. "Because, my dear Watson, I know that there are certain things that a person simply cannot ignore. The fact that Miss Clara Bennett feels the need to reach out to me, despite the ocean between us, tells me that she knows something is amiss in this case, something far beyond the grasp of local authorities. She has sensed the truth that many overlook. This is no simple disappearance. This is the work of something or someone intent on erasing her brother from existence." Watson looked at his friend, his expression shifting from concern to a reluctant admiration. "You're going to take the case, then?" Holmes's gaze was unyielding. "Of course. We leave for New York tomorrow." The next morning, Holmes and Watson found themselves aboard a steamer bound for America. As the ship cut through the churning waters of the Atlantic, the two men sat in the ship's lounge awaiting their arrival. Holmes seemed deep in thought, his eyes flicking occasionally to the distant horizon. "What do you make of this organization she mentioned, the one that might be behind her brother's disappearance?" Watson asked after a long silence. Holmes glanced up, his eyes sharp. "I cannot say for certain, Watson, but I suspect there is a powerful entity at work here, one that operates outside the law, perhaps even outside of the known boundaries of human understanding. There is more to this world than meets the eye, my friend, and I have learned time and again that those who can hide in plain sight often possess the most dangerous power." "You think this group might be behind Samuel Bennett's disappearance?" "I do," Holmes replied. "But why and how? Those are the questions that will guide us through this tangled web." Upon their arrival in New York City, the bustling streets and bright lights of Times Square were an overwhelming contrast to the quiet fog of London. Holmes and Watson, with their keen awareness of the city's pulse, immediately set off to investigate. They made their way to the address Clara Bennett had provided, an apartment in a small, nondescript building near Times Square. Clara greeted them at the door, a woman in her mid-30s with eyes that betrayed a weariness far beyond her years. She ushered them inside and explained the details of her brother's disappearance. "Samuel was in the city for business," Clara began, her voice shaking slightly. "He was investigating a new venture, something related to technology. I didn't know much about it, but he had become rather secretive. Then 3 days ago, I received a brief telegram from him saying he had made a breakthrough. I haven't heard from him since." Holmes, as always, was quick to analyze the situation. "Did he mention any specific people, organizations, or places he was involved with?" Clara shook her head. "No, he never mentioned anyone in particular, but I have a feeling that whatever he stumbled upon, it was something dangerous." Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance. Dangerous. It was the very word that had been echoing in Holmes's mind ever since he'd read the letter. "Tell me," Holmes continued, "did your brother have any unusual visitors or contacts in the days before his disappearance?" Clara hesitated, as if weighing whether to reveal the truth. "There was one man," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "a man who came to see him a few days before he vanished. I don't know his name, but I know Samuel was uneasy around him. He seemed insistent, like he had an agenda. Do you have any description of this man?" Holmes asked, leaning forward. Clara nodded. "He was tall, with dark hair and sharp eyes. He wore a long coat, even though it was warm. I can't say more than that, but I have a feeling he's the key." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "This man could be the link we need. Watson, we have our first lead." As night fell over the city, Holmes and Watson set off in pursuit of the man Clara had described, following every lead, every whisper of suspicion. They were determined to uncover the truth no matter how dark or dangerous the path might become. And in the heart of Times Square, amidst the flashing lights and the chaotic streets, the first threads of the mystery began to weave together, signaling that the game was afoot. As Holmes and Watson departed Clara Bennett's apartment, the weight of the case seemed to settle on them both. The hustle of New York's Times Square swirled around them, bright neon signs flashing, yellow taxis honking, and crowds flowing in every direction. But neither man paid it much attention. Their minds were elsewhere, wrapped in the mystery of Samuel Bennett's disappearance. Holmes, with his trademark sharp focus, led the way down the crowded streets. Watson, ever the loyal companion, followed closely behind, taking in the overwhelming sight of the city. The noises, the unfamiliar smells, the endless flow of people, everything was an assault on his senses. Yet, as always, his thoughts remained with Holmes, watching as his friend moved with the kind of quiet intensity that only he could muster. Holmes didn't speak as they walked. His mind was working, piecing together what little they had learned thus far. The description Clara Bennett had given them of her brother's secretive nature. The man with sharp eyes and the unsettling presence was vivid, yet vague enough to make it difficult to follow any clear leads. And there was something else. The feeling that the case was more than just a missing persons inquiry. The mention of technology, the vague fear in Clara's voice, the strange tension surrounding Samuel Bennett's disappearance. Holmes could sense it all, like an invisible thread pulling at his thoughts, urging him to uncover something deeper. They walked for several blocks until Holmes suddenly stopped in front of a nondescript building. A small weathered sign read Bennett & Co., an old business that appeared to have seen better days. Holmes turned to Watson, his eyes calculating. "We'll start here," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Bennett's company?" Watson asked, glancing at the building. "I suppose it's possible Samuel's disappearance has something to do with his work." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. If Samuel Bennett was indeed involved in something illicit, it's likely that his work, his connections, have led him into dangerous territory. I'd wager that this company of his will reveal more than Clara has told us." The door creaked as they entered the building. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and age. The space was dimly lit, with rows of old filing cabinets and cluttered desks scattered haphazardly around the room. The faint hum of a fluorescent light buzzed overhead, adding an eerie undertone to the otherwise quiet office. Holmes moved swiftly, his eyes scanning every inch of the room. He walked to the nearest desk, which was piled high with papers and documents, some of which appeared to be financial records. Watson watched as Holmes sifted through the papers with practiced efficiency. "Nothing here," Holmes muttered, moving to the next desk. He picked up a few documents, then turned to Watson. "But look at this, Watson." Watson stepped forward, his eyes focusing on the document in Holmes's hand. It was a ledger of sorts, filled with names, dates, and amounts. What stood out, however, was the irregularity in the entries. Some of the names seemed to repeat, and there were annotations beside them, notes in the margins that didn't quite make sense. "Strange," Watson said, frowning. "It looks like there's some sort of code here." Holmes nodded, scanning the document carefully. Indeed, whoever Samuel Bennett was working with was meticulous. These aren't just business transactions. There's something more. A pattern that, when decoded, might reveal the truth behind his disappearance. He turned to Watson, his eyes sharp with determination. "We need to find someone who can decipher this. Someone who understands codes. We'll take this to a colleague of mine in the city. He'll know what to make of it." As they made their way out of the building, the weight of the case seemed to grow heavier. Every step they took led them deeper into a world they didn't fully understand. A world where danger and deception lurked behind every corner. And yet, despite the unease creeping up on them, neither Holmes nor Watson hesitated. They had a purpose now, a new thread to pull on, and they would follow it until the mystery unraveled. The next morning, Holmes and Watson found themselves in the office of a cryptographer named Aaron West, a man Holmes had worked with on several previous cases. West's office was far more modern than the dusty, cluttered space they had visited the day before. It was sleek and professional, with neat shelves filled with books and various instruments used for decoding messages. Aaron West was a tall, thin man with sharp features and a calm demeanor. He greeted Holmes and Watson with a nod, his gray eyes quickly scanning the documents Holmes had brought with him. "This is quite the puzzle, Holmes," West said, his voice low and thoughtful as he examined the ledger. "It's not the typical cipher, but there's definitely something coded here. Let me get to work on it. It'll take some time, but I should be able to break it down." Holmes nodded in agreement. "Take your time, West. We'll return later." As they left West's office, Watson glanced at Holmes, his brow furrowing with concern. "Do you really think this code will lead us to Samuel Bennett? Or is it just a distraction?" Holmes looked up at the towering buildings that surrounded them, the city's skyline cutting through the blue sky. "I believe the code will reveal something important, Watson. Samuel Bennett was not just a businessman. He was involved in something far deeper, something far more dangerous. This code is part of that web." They spent the next several hours waiting for West to finish his work, using the time to explore more of New York City's bustling streets. Holmes, however, was always alert, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the crowds for any sign of the man Clara had described. The tall figure, the dark hair, the piercing eyes. It was becoming clear that someone somewhere was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. By late afternoon, West had called them back to his office. Holmes and Watson hurried there, eager to see what the cryptographer had uncovered. West was sitting at his desk, a satisfied look on his face as he looked up at the two men. "I've cracked it," he said, gesturing to a series of numbers and letters written on a piece of paper in front of him. It wasn't as difficult as I thought. What we have here is a series of coordinates, locations around the city. Holmes leaned forward, his interest piqued. Coordinates? Locations? West nodded. Exactly. It seems that whoever created this ledger was marking certain places, possibly where events of significance took place. And given the context of the disappearance, I would venture to guess that these locations are tied to Samuel Bennett's involvement in something illegal. Holmes's mind raced as he studied the coordinates. This is it, Watson. These locations will lead us to the heart of the mystery. We must visit each of these places immediately. The evening light cast long shadows across the streets of New York as Holmes and Watson made their way from one location to the next. The coordinates led them through alleyways under dark bridges and into areas of the city that felt far removed from the bright lights of Times Square. Every place was more isolated than the last, and with each step, Holmes grew more certain that they were closing in on something significant. At the final location, a rundown warehouse tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, they found their first real clue. The door creaked as they entered, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. Inside, the faintest traces of movement caught Holmes's eye, a shadow passing quickly along the back wall. Without hesitation, he motioned for Watson to follow and moved forward, every sense on high alert. They entered a room, only to find themselves face to face with a group of men. They were tall, wearing dark coats, and their eyes were cold with the same sharpness described by Clara. These men were not ordinary criminals. They were professionals, trained in the art of intimidation. One of the men stepped forward, his voice smooth and menacing. "You've come too far, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Now you'll need to leave, or face the consequences." Holmes stood tall, his eyes unwavering. "I have no intention of leaving until I have the answers I seek. Samuel Bennett's disappearance is just the beginning, and I will find out what happened to him." Holmes stood motionless, his sharp eyes never leaving the group of men who had surrounded them. The shadows in the warehouse deepened, cloaking the figures in darkness, but their intent was clear. They were not here by chance. They were waiting for something, and it was becoming painfully obvious that Holmes and Watson were the something. The air felt thicker now, charged with an electric tension that could only lead to an unavoidable confrontation. The man who had spoken, the one who appeared to be the leader, took another step forward. His face was partially obscured by the dim light, but his eyes, cold, calculating, were unmistakable. "I would advise you to leave, Mr. Holmes," the man repeated, his voice a low, guttural tone that carried the weight of unspoken threats. "You've come too far into something that doesn't concern you. This is your last warning." Holmes didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, locked on the leader, while his mind quickly assessed the situation. Every detail counted now. The arrangement of the men, the faint sound of machinery whirring in the background, the almost imperceptible tension in the air. It wasn't just a warehouse. It was a stronghold, a place where these men, whoever they were, operated from. "And what exactly do you think is going to happen if I leave?" Holmes asked calmly, his voice cutting through the charged silence. "I am not one to back down from a challenge, especially when a man's life is at stake." The leader's lips twitched, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're more persistent than I gave you credit for, Mr. Holmes. But persistence won't save you. Nor will your intellect." Holmes raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the veiled threat. "So you're saying that my mind won't be enough to get me out of here alive?" The leader's eyes flickered to the other men behind him, who stepped forward in unison, closing the distance. "This isn't about your intellect, Holmes. This is about your ability to survive." Before Holmes could respond, a sharp noise echoed from the far corner of the warehouse. It was the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut. The men turned their heads, momentarily distracted, and that split-second shift in focus was all Holmes needed. In a flash, Holmes seized the moment, springing into action. His cane, always more than a simple walking aid, flashed upward with surgical precision. He struck the leader's arm, knocking the man's weapon, an intimidating-looking revolver, out of his hand in one smooth motion. The leader staggered back, eyes wide in surprise, but Holmes wasn't finished. "Watson!" Holmes shouted as he pivoted, ready for the next move. Watson, ever the faithful companion, reacted immediately, lunging forward to disarm one of the other men who had attempted to grab him from behind. A quick, fluid motion, and the man was on the ground, his weapon now in Watson's hands. The remaining men hesitated for just a fraction of a second, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Holmes, never one to waste time, seized on that brief moment of doubt. He moved with practiced grace, pushing the leader back and keeping him at a distance with his cane while Watson handled the remaining threats. "Get down, Watson," Holmes shouted, and Watson instinctively dropped to a crouch as Holmes swiped the cane low, knocking another man off his feet. The leader, now recovering his composure, lunged forward, aiming a vicious strike at Holmes. But Holmes was ready. In a fluid motion, he sidestepped, spinning the cane in his hand and blocking the attack. With a quick flick of the wrist, Holmes caught the leader's arm, twisting it behind him and forcing the man to the ground with a calculated move. The fight was over almost as soon as it had started. Within moments, the remaining men were disarmed and subdued. Holmes stood over the leader, his expression one of cold calculation. "You were saying something about survival?" Holmes remarked with a raised eyebrow. The leader, now pinned to the ground, growled, his teeth bared. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Holmes. You've made a grave mistake." Holmes leaned in close, his voice low and deliberate. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You're part of a network, one that's been operating in the shadows for far too long. The Black Lotus, if I'm not mistaken." The man's eyes flashed with surprise, but then he smiled. A cruel, knowing smile. "You're more perceptive than I thought. But it won't matter. We'll find you, and when we do, you'll wish you never crossed us." Holmes stood, straightening his coat with a calm that belied the tension in the room. "I have no doubt that you'll try, but that's a problem for another time." He turned to Watson, who had already begun tying up the incapacitated men. "Watson, secure them. I'll make sure our friend here is properly interrogated." The leader, still seething with anger, was forced to sit against a wall as Holmes circled him, inspecting the room for any further clues. There were no obvious signs of what the Black Lotus was truly after, no direct evidence of Samuel Bennett, but Holmes wasn't blind to the subtle details. The way the men had moved, the efficiency with which they'd surrounded them. It was a clear indication of their training and the high stakes of this operation. Holmes crouched in front of the leader. "Tell me about Samuel Bennett," he said, his voice cold and calculated. "What do you know about his disappearance? And why were you watching him?" The leader refused to answer at first, staring defiantly at Holmes. But Holmes was patient. He knew that threats alone wouldn't work. Instead, he simply waited, his unblinking gaze never leaving the man's face. Minutes passed, the silence thick and oppressive. Finally, the leader broke. "Bennett wasn't supposed to get involved," the man muttered, his voice low and bitter. "He was too curious for his own good. We didn't plan for him to find out what he did. He started asking the wrong questions, poking around where he wasn't supposed to." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "What questions exactly?" The leader hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as though considering his options. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "He got too close to the technology. The device. He found out about it. He figured out what we were building, what it could do. He started threatening to expose us, to ruin everything." Holmes was already piecing the information together. "The device," he repeated. "A technological device of some kind?" The man nodded, a look of frustration crossing his face. "A machine capable of making people disappear. Completely. Erased from existence." Holmes froze, his mind instantly racing through a dozen possible scenarios. Disappearances, people vanishing without a trace. It all made sense now. The Black Lotus wasn't just a criminal syndicate. They were using a technology far beyond anything ordinary men had access to. "Where is the device now?" Holmes demanded. The leader laughed, a harsh mocking sound. "You think we'd just let you walk away with that kind of information, Holmes? You have no idea how deep this goes." Holmes stood, his face a mask of calm determination. "I don't need to know everything right now, but I will find it. And when I do, I'll make sure you and your network are exposed for all the world to see." He turned to Watson. "We've learned enough here. It's time to move." Watson nodded, his face grim. "We're not done yet, are we?" Holmes gave him a brief, fleeting smile. "Not by a long shot." As they left the warehouse, the night air of New York was colder than before, heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. The Black Lotus was real, and their plans were far more dangerous than Holmes had anticipated. But now, with a clearer understanding of the stakes, he was more determined than ever to uncover the full extent of the organization's reach, and, more importantly, to find Samuel Bennett before it was too late. The game was afoot, and Holmes knew that every step from here on out would bring him closer to the heart of a dark conspiracy that threatened to change everything. Holmes and Watson moved swiftly through the streets of New York, the night air heavy with a sense of urgency. The discovery they had just made in the warehouse had shifted the case into far more dangerous territory than either of them had anticipated. A machine capable of making people disappear, erased from existence. It was the kind of technology that could change the balance of power in the world, and it was now in the hands of an organization with no moral compass. Holmes's mind raced, but his exterior remained calm and focused. He had always known that this case would be complicated, but the revelation of the device left him with far more questions than answers. Who had created it? How had it been developed in secret? And most importantly, where was Samuel Bennett? "We need to find that device," Holmes said, his voice steady, though his pace quickened. "That's the key to everything. It's not just about Bennett anymore. It's about stopping this technology from falling into the wrong hands." Watson nodded in agreement, though his face betrayed the unease that had settled in his chest. The implications of what they had uncovered were massive. A machine that could make people disappear. What else could such a device be used for? The potential for misuse was limitless. As they approached the end of the block, Holmes turned abruptly, leading them toward a narrow alleyway that seemed oddly out of place in the bustling city. Watson followed, trusting Holmes implicitly, but the tension in the air was palpable. They had crossed into a different world now, one where shadows moved with intent, where the line between ally and enemy was blurred. Holmes stopped at a door tucked between two dilapidated buildings. It was an old steel-reinforced entryway, with no signage or indication of what lay behind it. He knocked 3 times, a sharp, deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo into the stillness of the alley. Moments later, a small window in the door slid open and a pair of sharp eyes studied them from the other side. "Holmes," a gruff voice called out. "I didn't expect you tonight." The door creaked open, revealing a man dressed in dark, practical clothing. He was middle-aged, with a weathered face and a glint of recognition in his eyes. His name was Roland Pierce, and though his work was often on the fringes of the law, Holmes trusted him. Pierce was a former intelligence officer with deep connections, and more importantly, he was a man who knew how to uncover things that others wanted hidden. "We need your help," Holmes said, stepping into the dimly lit room. "The Black Lotus has developed a device, something capable of making people vanish. We need to track it down." Pierce raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem particularly surprised. He had been involved in enough covert operations to know that secrets like this were never as simple as they seemed. He gestured toward a table where a map of New York City was spread out, several locations marked with red pins. "I've been tracking them for months," Pierce said, his voice low. "The Black Lotus has its fingers in many pies, but this device, it's their most closely guarded secret. They've kept it well hidden, but I've gathered intel on a few places where it might be." Holmes studied the map, his eyes scanning the locations Pierce had highlighted. "These are all within the industrial sector. Is it possible that the device is being stored in one of these locations?" Pierce nodded. "They've been using old warehouses, abandoned factories, places that can be easily fortified. They don't want anyone stumbling across it. We need to act quickly," Holmes said. "They know we're onto them, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone in their way. We'll start with the closest location." Pierce hesitated for a moment. "Be careful, Holmes. The Black Lotus doesn't just kill. They make people disappear. This technology isn't just about physical elimination. It's worse. Much worse." Holmes gave a brief, thoughtful nod. "I understand. But we're not leaving until we've found that device." The city was quieter now as they made their way toward the first location on the list. The streets seemed more ominous in the darkness, the tall buildings casting long shadows over the alleyways they passed. Watson felt the weight of the night pressing in on him. He was accustomed to danger, but this felt different. The Black Lotus, this mysterious organization, seemed to exist in the very fabric of the city itself, hidden in plain sight, operating beyond the reach of ordinary law. As they neared the location, Holmes stopped, holding up a hand to signal Watson to be silent. The warehouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of streetlights. There were no windows visible from the outside, just a large, heavy door and a series of metal gates that were shut tight. Holmes crouched low, examining the perimeter. "They've been here recently," he murmured. "The gates haven't rusted yet and the footprints around the door are fresh. This is their hideout. Should we enter?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled a small pair of lockpicks from his coat pocket and began working on the door. His movements were fluid, precise, and expert at his craft. It took only a moment before the lock clicked open, and the door creaked quietly as Holmes pushed it inward. The warehouse interior was dark and cavernous, the air thick with the smell of oil and decay. Holmes pulled out a small lantern, the faint glow revealing rows of large crates stacked high along the walls. The faint hum of machinery echoed from deeper within the building, adding to the eerie atmosphere. "We need to be quick," Holmes whispered. "If the device is here, we need to find it before they realize we've come." Watson nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver holstered at his side. They moved cautiously, step by step, glancing around for any sign of the device or the men guarding it. Every sound seemed magnified in the silence of the warehouse. The soft scraping of their shoes against the concrete floor, the distant clink of metal. Holmes led the way deeper into the building, his keen eyes searching for anything out of place. They passed several large crates, their contents unknown. But Holmes wasn't interested in them. He was focused on the faint glow that seemed to emanate from further down the hall. He moved faster now, his steps quickening until he reached a heavy steel door at the far end of the warehouse. "This is it," Holmes murmured. "The device must be behind this door." With a swift motion, Holmes pressed his ear against the door, listening for any sound from within. Nothing. He reached for the handle and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room inside. At the center of the room sat a large machine, its surface covered in wires and glowing panels. It was far more advanced than anything Holmes had seen before, sleek, intricate, and dangerous. The device was unlike anything that could be built with ordinary technology. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a twisted fusion of science and terror. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the device. "This is it," he said, his voice a whisper of awe and disbelief. "This is what they've been hiding." Watson stepped closer, his face pale as he examined the machine. "What is it? What does it do?" Holmes's eyes were cold as he reached out to touch the machine. "It's a device capable of erasing people. Not just killing them, no, that would be too simple. This device can make someone vanish as if they were never there." He paused, turning to Watson. "It's worse than we thought, Watson. If they use this on a larger scale, they could control entire populations. They could make anyone disappear, an entire city if they wished." Watson swallowed hard. "We can't let them use it." Holmes nodded grimly. "No, we need to destroy it before they have a chance to activate it." As they approached the machine, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hall behind them. Holmes's instincts flared and he quickly turned, his hand reaching for his revolver. The Black Lotus had arrived. The sound of footsteps echoed down the dark corridor, their heavy rhythm quickening with each passing second. Holmes and Watson froze, their bodies tense, ears straining to discern the number of individuals approaching. The flickering lantern cast eerie shadows across the room, its weak light barely cutting through the darkness. Every instinct told Holmes that they had overstayed their welcome. Someone was coming for the device. Holmes motioned for Watson to stay low, his eyes scanning the room for a way out. The door to the hallway was still ajar, but there was no time to think about an escape. The Black Lotus had arrived and they would not leave without a fight. "They're not just coming for us, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice a mere breath. "They're coming for the device. If we're not careful, they'll take it and use it before we can stop them." Watson nodded, his face set in a grim line. They had no choice but to act swiftly. The machine in front of them, the device capable of erasing people from existence, had to be destroyed. It was the key to everything. If the Black Lotus could activate it, there would be no stopping them. It was not just a weapon. It was a tool of unimaginable power, and they could not afford to let it fall into the wrong hands. The footsteps grew louder. Holmes turned to Watson, his eyes locked with his companion's. "We have seconds, Watson. We need to make sure the device doesn't survive this." The first of the Black Lotus members appeared in the doorway, tall and lean, his face obscured by the low brim of his hat. Holmes recognized him immediately. He had seen him earlier at the warehouse. The man was armed, a revolver strapped to his side, and his eyes darted around the room, scanning every corner for the two detectives. "Holmes," the man said coldly, his voice low but edged with a threat of anger. "You should have stayed out of this. Now you're in way over your head." Holmes didn't flinch. His mind was already working, calculating their next move. The odds were against them. There were at least 3 more men outside, possibly more. They had to act fast. He glanced briefly at the machine, noting the intricate design, the glowing panels. If it had a power source, that would be their target. A quick shot, a well-placed strike, it could disable the device long enough for them to escape. The man in the doorway stepped further into the room, his posture relaxed, but his hand resting on his weapon. "You should have listened to me, Holmes. You have no idea what you're up against." Holmes kept his voice steady, masking the tension building in his chest. "I've seen enough to know that you and your organization are far more dangerous than you realize, and I intend to stop you." The man smiled, but it was a cold, humorless expression. "You really think you can stop us? The Black Lotus isn't just a criminal organization. We are something more. We have the power to reshape the world. You're nothing more than an obstacle, and obstacles are easily removed." Watson's grip tightened on his revolver, but Holmes subtly shook his head, signaling him to wait. They needed more time. The man in the doorway was only the first. There would be others, and they needed to know exactly where the device's power source was before they acted. They needed to disable it, not just destroy it, but time was running out. Holmes could hear the sounds of movement coming from the hallway. They were closing in. "We've come too far to back down now," Holmes said, his voice calm and deliberate, though inside his mind raced. "The device ends here. You're not taking it." The man's smile faded and his hand twitched toward the gun at his side. The tension in the room was palpable, each breath held between the two sides. But before the man could act, Holmes's sharp eyes caught something in the corner of the room. A small electrical panel on the far wall, just beneath the glowing panels of the device. A way to cut its power, perhaps. Holmes turned to Watson, his mind already racing through the steps. "Watson, the panel. If we cut the power, we might be able to disable it long enough to—" Before he could finish, the sound of footsteps exploded into the room. More men, now fully armed, rushed in, their guns drawn. Holmes's mind flicked into overdrive. There was no time to think. He reached for his cane, swinging it at the man closest to him with a precision that only years of practice could afford. The force of the blow sent the man crashing to the ground, his weapon skittering across the floor. Watson moved in sync with him, taking out another man with a swift punch to the jaw before disarming him. The remaining men hesitated, momentarily stunned by the speed of the attack. "Now, Watson," Holmes barked, his voice urgent. "The panel!" Watson didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he dashed toward the wall, knocking aside a few crates to reveal the small panel. He pried it open, revealing a tangle of wires and circuitry, and without a second thought he yanked the largest wire loose. There was a sharp hum, followed by a sudden silence. The lights in the room flickered before going dark. The machine's glow dimmed, its once constant hum now gone. For a brief, fleeting moment they had succeeded. But the Black Lotus wasn't finished yet. The leader, enraged by the turn of events, drew his gun with lightning speed. Holmes saw it coming in the same instant the man's hand moved. Without thinking, he threw himself to the side, feeling the rush of air as a bullet grazed his coat. "Get down!" Watson shouted, grabbing Holmes by the arm and pulling him out of the line of fire. The room erupted in chaos as the remaining Black Lotus members attempted to regroup, but they were disoriented by the sudden loss of the machine's power. Holmes rolled to the side, his mind already working, calculating their next move. "Watson, cover me!" he shouted. Watson fired a few rounds, forcing the men to retreat back into the shadows. Holmes took the opportunity, moving swiftly toward the now powerless machine. He examined the device quickly, looking for a way to destroy it completely. The wires that connected it to the power source were severed, but there were still backup systems in place, he could tell. They wouldn't have made it this easy, but Holmes was determined. He grabbed a nearby metal pipe and began smashing at the base of the device, his eyes never leaving the machine's glowing panels. Each strike brought a satisfying crack, the metal caving under the force of his blows. Sparks flew, and the room lit up briefly with flashes of electricity before the device began to sputter and die. The leader, who had been watching from the shadows, moved swiftly toward them, gun raised, but he wasn't fast enough. Holmes and Watson were already in motion. Watson fired once, hitting the man square in the shoulder, sending him sprawling to the floor. "Is that the last of them?" Watson asked, his voice calm despite the chaos. Holmes paused for a moment, breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the room. The remaining Black Lotus members were either unconscious or too wounded to continue fighting. The machine was destroyed, at least for now. "I believe so," Holmes said, his voice low but filled with determination. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Holmes moved to the center of the room, surveying the wreckage of the device. The Black Lotus had planned for this moment, and now that the machine had been disabled, they would undoubtedly go to greater lengths to retrieve it. The stakes were higher than ever. "We need to leave before they regroup," Holmes said, turning to Watson. "But we cannot stop here. There are still people out there, powerful people, who will stop at nothing to retrieve this technology." Watson nodded. "Then we make sure they never get the chance." Together they moved quickly through the darkened warehouse, their footsteps echoing in the silence left behind by the battle. The night was far from over, and the mysteries surrounding the Black Lotus were far from solved. The clock was ticking, and Holmes knew that whatever came next would be even more dangerous than what they had already faced. But they were ready. The night air was thick with the lingering tension of their escape, the silence of the broken warehouse pressing in around Holmes and Watson as they made their way toward the narrow alleyway where their cab awaited. Every footstep seemed to echo too loudly in the empty streets of New York, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move in a game that was far from over. Holmes moved with a focused, almost mechanical precision, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. Watson, though equally alert, couldn't shake the weight of what they had just accomplished. The machine destroyed. The Black Lotus crippled, at least for now. Yet, as Holmes had pointed out, this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. "They'll come for us, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low as if he were speaking to himself more than to his companion. "The Black Lotus is not easily thwarted. They'll want to know who's responsible for this." Watson nodded grimly, keeping pace beside his friend. "You think they'll send more men? Or do you expect them to escalate?" "I expect them to do both," Holmes replied, glancing over his shoulder. "They won't take this defeat lying down, and they have resources far more than we can imagine." The cab rattled through the streets, its tires cutting through the humid air as they made their way to a safe house. A small, unremarkable building in a less conspicuous part of town. Holmes had made the decision to lay low for a while, hoping to gain some much-needed distance from the organization. They couldn't risk another direct confrontation until they had more information, more leverage. As they entered the safe house, Holmes motioned for Watson to be quiet, his expression tense. "I need to think. We've made progress, but now we have to plan our next move carefully." Watson, still processing the chaos of the night, took a seat by the window, gazing out at the city that seemed deceptively calm. "What do you think their next move will be?" Holmes paced, his eyes narrowing as his mind worked through the possibilities. The Black Lotus has been operating in the shadows for too long. A setback like this will not be tolerated. They'll regroup, they'll lick their wounds, and then they'll come back harder than before. But we've struck a blow. The device they've worked so hard to conceal is gone. For now, at least. They'll likely search for another one that could serve the same purpose. "But the technology," Watson interrupted, his voice thick with disbelief. "A machine that can erase someone from existence. It sounds like something out of science fiction, but it's real. And they've been using it for, what, political manipulation? Power?" Holmes turned, his eyes intense as he met Watson's gaze. "That's the key, Watson. The power it holds isn't just about eliminating people. It's about control. The ability to make someone disappear. Not just physically, but from history itself. Imagine the implications. A person wiped from existence, their name erased from records, from memory. The Black Lotus could change the very fabric of society. They could rewrite history, eliminate rivals, destroy entire governments. And all without a trace," Watson shuddered. "We have to stop them. Before they do it again," Holmes nodded. "We will, but we need more information. We need to know how they developed this technology, who's behind it, and most importantly, we need to find out if they have another device, one that's operational." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Holmes immediately tensed. his hand moving instinctively toward the revolver holstered beneath his coat. "Stay here," he whispered to Watson. "I'll handle this." The door creaked open, revealing a figure in the shadows. Holmes's eyes flicked over the visitor's appearance, quickly assessing the situation. The figure stepped inside, revealing a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. She was dressed in a dark coat, her expression sharp and determined. "Holmes," she said, her voice low but urgent. "I need to speak with you." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his stance never faltering. "And you are?" "I'm Dr. Eleanor Brooks," she replied, stepping into the room. "I've been following the Black Lotus for years. I know what they're capable of. I've seen the technology they've developed, and I can help you stop them." Watson looked between them, his curiosity piqued. "You're a scientist?" Dr. Brooks nodded. "Yes, I specialize in advanced technology. But what they've been working on, it's beyond anything I've ever seen. I can't stand by and let them use it for their own purposes." Holmes' eyes narrowed as he assessed her. "What do you know about the device? How did you come across this information?" "I used to work for a company that supplied the Black Lotus with research materials," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "At first it seemed like any other contract, but then I realized what they were really after. I tried to leave, but they threatened me, made sure I understood the consequences of betraying them. I've been in hiding ever since. And now you're offering your help?" Watson asked, his tone cautious but hopeful. Dr. Brooks nodded again, her eyes filled with resolve. "You've already destroyed one device, but there's another, more advanced. I know where it is. I can help you get to it before they do." Holmes regarded her carefully, then glanced at Watson. "What do you think, Watson?" Watson hesitated for a moment before answering. If she's telling the truth, she could be the key to finding the Black Lotus and stopping them for good. Holmes took a long, slow breath, his mind weighing the decision. The danger was immense, but Dr. Brooks had information that could change the course of the investigation. It was too valuable to ignore. "Very well," Holmes said, his voice steady. "We'll work together. But know this, if you're lying to us, I'll find out. And you'll regret it." Dr. Brooks's expression remained unchanged, her resolve unbroken. "I'm not lying, Mr. Holmes. I want to stop them just as much as you do." Holmes nodded. "Good. We'll leave for the location immediately. Time is of the essence." The cab sped through the city, the streets now eerily quiet, as Holmes, Watson, and Dr. Brooks made their way toward the new location. They didn't have much time, every second counted. The Black Lotus was regrouping, and if Dr. Brooks's information was correct, they would be heading straight into the heart of their operation. As the city's skyline began to blur behind them, Holmes couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The Black Lotus wouldn't just let them waltz in and take another device. They had underestimated Holmes once. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The game had shifted. The stakes were higher than ever. Dr. Brooks leaned forward, her face illuminated by the dim light of the cab. "The device is in an old facility, a research lab in an abandoned part of the city," she said, her voice steady. "It's heavily guarded, but I know the way in. There's a back entrance, one that leads directly to the lab." Holmes nodded, his mind already calculating the best approach. "We'll go in fast, disable the security, and secure the device before they have a chance to activate it." "Do you have any idea how far along they are in their preparations?" "They've already tested it," Dr. Brooks replied. "But they haven't yet used it on a large scale." "Not yet. That's why they've been so secretive about it. They don't want anyone knowing what they're capable of." Holmes's eyes flashed with understanding. That's why they were so desperate to keep it hidden. They didn't want the public to know what they could do. "And now we're going to make sure they never get the chance to use it again," Watson added, his voice firm. The cab turned onto a quiet street, the building in question looming ahead. It was a sprawling complex surrounded by high walls and barbed wire, its windows dark and foreboding. This was the Black Lotus's stronghold, the heart of their operations, and it was where their final confrontation would take place. Holmes's grip tightened on his cane, his mind already racing through their plan of action. He wasn't sure what they would face inside, but one thing was clear. This was it. The endgame had arrived. "We move quickly," Holmes said, his voice steady with purpose. "We take the device and we get out. No mistakes." As they approached the building, the door of the cab opened with a soft click. Holmes and Watson stepped out, their eyes scanning the complex as they prepared for the most dangerous phase of the mission yet. Dr. Brooks led the way, her confidence unwavering as she guided them toward the back entrance. This was the moment. The Black Lotus would either fall, or they would become more powerful than ever. And Holmes intended to make sure it was the former. The night hung heavy over the abandoned complex, the air thick with the smell of rust and damp concrete. Holmes, Watson, and Dr. Brooks moved silently through the shadows, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the Black Lotus operation. The faintest hum of machinery could be heard in the distance, reverberating through the cold, empty corridors of the building. It was the kind of place that seemed to swallow sound, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old structure, as though the building itself were alive, waiting for them to make their next move. Dr. Brooks led the way, her movements sure and steady. She had been in and out of places like this before, and her familiarity with the labyrinthine layout of the complex was invaluable. Holmes kept pace with her, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every shadow as he prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Watson followed close behind, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver, ready for whatever might come. They reached a small door at the back of the building, tucked away behind a stack of rusted metal crates. Dr. Brooks paused, glancing at Holmes for confirmation. With a nod, Holmes gave the signal. She moved quickly, slipping through the door and into the dark corridor beyond. Holmes followed, his mind already working through the steps of their plan. They had no time to waste. They needed to find the device, disable it, and get out, before the Black Lotus realized they were there. The hallway was narrow, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling and flickering lights casting an eerie glow on the concrete walls. The further they went, the more they felt the oppressive weight of the place. It was as though the very walls were closing in on them, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. They passed several doors, each one locked or bolted shut, but there was no sign of any guards. It was too quiet, almost too easy. "This is the heart of their operation," Holmes muttered under his breath, his voice low but filled with conviction. "They've been hiding in plain sight for far too long." Dr. Brooks glanced over her shoulder, her expression grim. "This is where they've been conducting their experiments, perfecting the device." "We're close." Holmes nodded, his pace quickening. They were nearing the room that Dr. Brooks had described, a small fortified lab where the Black Lotus had been testing their machine. It was crucial that they reach it before the Black Lotus realized their mistake. If they were lucky, they could disable the device, perhaps even destroy it before they had a chance to use it again. But luck was something Holmes rarely relied on, and he wasn't about to start now. They reached a door at the end of the hall, reinforced with steel and guarded by a biometric security system. Dr. Brooks stepped forward, her hands steady as she moved to the panel beside the door. A few quick movements, a soft beep, and the door clicked open. Holmes motioned for Watson to cover the hallway as he entered the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The air inside was heavy with the scent of chemicals, the sharp tang of ozone mixing with the faint hum of electronics. The room was dimly lit, a series of monitors lining the far wall, each displaying data streams that made little sense to Holmes at first glance. But what caught his attention immediately was the machine in the center of the room. It was larger than the one they had destroyed earlier, its design more sophisticated. Wires and cables snaked across the floor, connecting the machine to an array of power generators that hummed ominously. The glowing panels on the device flickered with strange pulsing light, casting long shadows across the room. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a fusion of science and dark intention. Holmes could feel the weight of it, the potential for destruction that lay within the device. "Is that it?" Watson asked from the doorway, his voice low but filled with awe. Holmes didn't answer immediately. His mind was already racing, analyzing the device, calculating their next move. There was no time to waste. He turned to Dr. Brooks, his gaze sharp. "How do we disable it?" Dr. Brooks moved forward, her eyes flicking to the machine as she assessed it. "It's a more advanced version of the one you destroyed, but it's still powered by the same technology. The power source is right there." She pointed to a large glowing crystal embedded in the center of the machine, but it's heavily protected by a series of circuits. If we disrupt the flow of power, we can shut it down, but we'll need to be quick. Holmes nodded, his eyes scanning the room for any potential threats. "How much time do we have before they realize what's happening?" "We don't know," Dr. Brooks replied, her voice tight with tension. But it won't take long for the Black Lotus to notice something's wrong. If we're not careful, they'll lock down the entire facility. Holmes didn't hesitate. He moved toward the machine, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the power cables as he quickly identified the weak points. Every decision now had to be perfect. One wrong move and the device could be activated, and they would be facing a far more dangerous opponent than they had anticipated. "We'll cut the power supply first," Holmes muttered, almost to himself. "Then we disable the circuits. Watson, stay alert. We can't afford to be caught off guard." Watson nodded, his eyes scanning the door and the shadows beyond. They had already been in this situation before, but the stakes were much higher now. They weren't just dealing with criminals. They were dealing with a force that had the power to alter reality itself. Holmes moved swiftly, using his cane to pry open a panel on the side of the machine. A series of wires and circuits were exposed, their intricate design sending a shiver of unease down his spine. He didn't have much time. He worked quickly, his hand steady as he severed one wire after another, each snip bringing them closer to disabling the device. Sparks flew, and for a moment it seemed like the machine would retaliate, but Holmes didn't falter. He continued, his mind sharp, calculating each move with precision. "Holmes," Watson called from the doorway, his voice filled with urgency. "They're coming." "I hear footsteps." Holmes didn't look up. He could hear it too, distant but unmistakable. The Black Lotus was closing in, and if they didn't finish the job now, they would be trapped in the heart of their enemy's stronghold. Holmes took a deep breath and cut the final wire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the machine's glow flickered one last time before it went dark. Holmes stood back, watching as the device powered down. The hum of the facility grew quieter, and the oppressive feeling that had filled the room began to lift. For the first time in days, Holmes allowed himself a breath of relief. "We did it," Watson said, his voice filled with disbelief. Holmes didn't respond immediately. His mind was still alert, scanning for any signs of danger. The Black Lotus wasn't defeated yet. It was a setback, nothing more. "We've disabled the device," Holmes said, his voice steady. "But the Black Lotus will come for us. We need to leave. Now." Dr. Brooks moved toward the door, glancing back at the machine one last time. "It's over. For now." But Holmes wasn't convinced. The Black Lotus had resources beyond what they had seen. The machine had been destroyed, but they weren't finished. Not by a long shot. As they made their way toward the exit, Holmes's mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the next steps. There was still much to uncover and much more to be done. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Holmes knew that the Black Lotus would not rest until they had recovered the device, or built something even more dangerous. The doors to the facility burst open as they reached the exit. Armed men flooded the hall, their guns trained on the trio. Holmes froze, his mind working at lightning speed. They had no choice now. The Black Lotus had found them, but Holmes had faced worse odds before. "Stay close," Holmes said quietly, as he turned toward Watson and Dr. Brooks. "We fight our way out." The battle was only beginning. The Black Lotus would come for them with everything they had. But Holmes was prepared, and he knew that no matter the odds, he would see this through to the end.